Before we start talking about the Byzantine Empire, I'm just going to take a quick look at the catacombs and menorah. We covered the catacombs a little bit earlier. What these looked like, and what are they again? They are subterranean tombs housing the dead, obviously, often the sacred dead. And this menorah is one that was thought to be in Solomon's temple, keeping in mind we also had similar catacombs in Jewish tradition. Talking about the Byzantine Empire, a lot of changes are occurring. Constantine leaves Rome, moves to Byzantium and renames it Constantinople, what we know today as Istanbul. A very politically strategic move on Constantine's part. Things are moving east. There are barbarians at the gate, literally, in the western part of the empire. So he heads east, and he chooses this strategic point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which brings us directly to the most important Byzantine emperor, Justinian, who is a ruler in the early 500s. Under him, the art and architecture of this time coalesce into an entirely new visual language of the empire. And this is most notably represented in the Hagia Sophia, one of the most magnificent architectural structures, a temple, if only in a metaphorical sense sometimes, and when it's been a mosque in a more literal sense, to the epitome of what an empire's rule can achieve. When we look at the Hagia Sophia, don't even consider the towers and the minarets. What dominates this structure? Its dome. A dome from Roman times, and a dome of this massiveness and height is not seen again until we get to the Florence Renaissance, centuries later. It's a very magnificent achievement and overwhelming to experience in person. 40 windows alone at the base, this vast dome with the greatest weight and pressure. And that so cleverly compensated for by the way this structure is constructed and the way that glass is inserted into it. It was built in an incredibly short period of time, reputedly 5 years. However, there were some drawbacks to that quick construction project. Big buttresses needed to be added to reinforce the dome, and that was to avert the fact that cracks started showing in the structure right away. Again, there are these very heavy weights and pressures that are strategically addressed in the building. Cascading domes at the top transfer the weight and pressure down to the bottom. So there's a principle of gravity at work here that makes this a successfully supported structure. It's the same principle that we'll see used in medieval arches, which are constructed with buttresses instead of domes. There's an enormous amount of decoration. It's so decorative, the Hagia Sophia. Ottoman Turks, Muslims, will call the city Istanbul when they come into power in the 1500s, in about 1450. They so adored the Hagia Sophia, they turned it into a mosque. And with other structures that have been consecrated and used by different religions in different ways, buildings like this contain long histories. It was originally a mosque. Now it's deconsecrated. It's a cultural center, more of a museum. And as mentioned last week, I think, there is now on the table the idea of returning the Hagia Sophia to functionality as an operational mosque. And you can see the way illumination functions as something coming from the heavens and illuminating the entirety of this magnificent structure. Here's a diagram, of course, with the ring of the 40 windows at the bottom of the dome, an architectural feat. And the way that the dome also mirrors the idea of the oracular aperture that we remember from the Roman Parthenon and the mosque at dusk, flooded by light, again, in what we now know as Istanbul. Moving to the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, we are looking at a structure that contains some of the most impressive images of the Emperor Justinian and his attendants and his wife, the Empress Theodora. The altar in the Church of San Vitale is on the side of the church, and the mosaics appear hovering above the altar. Here's a diagram here. We can see where the altar is at the far end, and the atrium later destroyed. That's a better interior view of it. And you can see the mosaics referenced of Justinian and Theodora in greater detail here. What are we looking at? Christ with his halo, of course. We can see, once again, he's on top of a dome that's purple. Sacred beings will always have halos, and of course, that includes Christ above all. He's flanked by angels. And in the mosaic of Justinian wearing purple, also, right, royal, and wearing a halo. In this space, which is called the apse, A-P-S-E, as it's a sacred one, only the priest celebrating Mass would have been allowed, and Justinian and Theodora present in their mosaics representation. Justinian is a new kind of emperor. He's a Christian one, and so he is having himself portrayed as wearing purple and crowned by a halo like Christ's. The clergy is in white, and the soldier's shield reflects the idea of Justinian's reign. After this conversion to Christianity, the population at this time, who were known as Cappadocians, are now subjects of populace, members of the Christian church. Theodora, pictured here, also in a halo with her ladies in waiting, holding the chalice cup. What is the chalice cup? In which the wine that is part of the Christian sacramental ceremony contains. There's a lot of very elaborate detail in these mosaics, and it's difficult to convey them. There's so much gold that doesn't get picked up by the camera. The wine and the gifts of the wine and bread are sewn into the hem of Theodora's gown, along with the storyline, the narrative of the three kings who first brought gifts to the baby Jesus, central part of the Christian Catholic, as we know it today, tradition, Christ's birth. The elaborate gold in their garments and in the background, again, doesn't show up with the camera. But when you are standing in these church spaces, the natural light flooding them just bounces this dazzling light coming in through the windows of the church onto the garments that just makes them sparkle. There are precious materials in that the mosaic is composed with: carnelian, mother of pearl, something called jadeite. So it creates this very rich, luxurious idea of not cheap glitter, but quite expensive, and colors and garments appropriate to royalty, and reinforces this idea of the lavishness of the Christian Catholic Church that often causes, that is often quite problematic for the Church in periods when it is accused of sacrificing the ultimate spiritual servicing of its constituents, of its members, to the church's compilation and gathering of riches unto itself. Hagia Sophia, as an afterthought here, means holy wisdom, which is an Eastern Orthodox, it's another name that the Eastern Orthodox religion used for Jesus. The book is a key vehicle for conveying Christian faith. What were these made out of, these pages? Vellum, which is animal skin. China is going to invent paper, but that's not going to get to Europe for a while. All these books, of course, are made by hand, these religious books. These are not Bibles. These are records of their bearers of the sacred stories and narratives that infuse the Christian faith. The word codex refers to the earliest of these book forms. They're quite painstakingly crafted, each one by hand. And if a copy was made, the monks would spend just as much time on that second copy as they would the first. The pages of these books are dyed purple, the royal color. And so that would be associated with any Byzantine emperor's gift of a book to him or from him. In these books, we have the idea of the combination of text and image, although it's quite hard, as in this page, to see texts. And what is the official language being used here in the Byzantine Church? It's Greek. That is the official church language. And it's a way of communicating to people who can't read these books with their exacting visuals that are quite effective at telling a storyline, such as the one here. Rebecca of the Bible walking out of town on a road with these teeny columns flanking her, and this idea of a more ancient story, the idea of a pagan water goddess. Rebecca is offering water to Jacob in this narrative. From that same period, really perfectly constructed image of Mary and the Christ child. And of course, we see these halos, these golden halos, being worn as emblematic representations of holiness. The idea of the iconoclastic controversy begins when believers begin to think that the sacred being is actually embodied in the image. There is the story, an actual one, of a woman who lived in Byzantine times who had images of the saints painted on the walls of her house. And ridiculous as it sounds, she ate them off the walls, of course, and consequently got sick. Why would she do such a crazy thing? The sanctity embodied in the image was something that she believed in this story, which has been verified as best as one can with historical documents by art historians, that by ingesting this image, she could take it into her body to heal herself and to sanctify herself. The beginnings of the iconoclastic controversy are in 726, and at that time, the church for a while ceases making images. There's an issue with John Calvin, who starts the Protestant faith, the Reformation, as it is known, and that proposes a different way of mediating this most important connection between believers and God. At times, at various junctures, this issue of the church's investment, the Catholic Christian Church's investment in icons, in images, in what the Jewish and Islamic faiths would call idolatry, idol worship, is something that plagues them and causes sometimes enough dissent among their believers that movements like John Calvin's Reformation and the beginnings of the Protestant faith interfere with the church's numbers and constituency, and there are various ways that crop up later on of the church's attempts to reclaim its members.